In a paradise-like setting, love seemed to have conquered everything, but the closer they got, the more he felt something slipping through his fingers, a lingering silence, a hidden fear, and a revelation that would change everything. On their honeymoon, the millionaire uncovered a shocking truth. Before you dive into this intense story of secrets, subscribe to the channel and get ready for a romance like no other. Richard Mitchell Morgan wasn't used to waiting. In his 35 years, he had built a real estate empire that placed him among the most influential men in the country. The Morgan name was synonymous with power, luxury, and open doors. His face appeared in business magazines, his name circulated in investors' conversations, and his parties were coveted by Chicago's social elite. On that rainy April afternoon, Richard was driving his Porsche through the narrow streets of the historic downtown when traffic came to a complete stop. An accident up ahead was blocking the main avenue. Irritated, he checked his watch. He was late for an important meeting with foreign investors. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. "I'll have to find an alternate route," he thought, turning abruptly onto a side street he didn't know. The rain intensified, making it almost impossible to see through the windshield. Richard slowed down, trying to orient himself in that labyrinth of old streets. That's when he noticed, almost hidden between two restored buildings, a small bookstore with an illuminated window that contrasted with the sky darkened by the storm. "Coffee and letters," said the wooden sign swinging above the door. With few options and needing to wait for the rain to diminish, Richard parked his car and ran inside the establishment. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and old books hit him immediately. The place was cozy. Dark wooden shelves covered the walls, worn leather sofas occupied the corners, and small round tables were scattered throughout the space. Some people were reading silently, others working on their laptops. "Can I help you?" The soft voice came from somewhere to his right. Richard turned and saw a woman of approximately 30 years old, brown hair tied in an unpretentious bun, thin-framed glasses and a brown apron over a simple dress. There was something in her gaze that made him hesitate for a moment, a mixture of gentleness and detachment that he wasn't used to encountering. "Just waiting for the rain to pass," he replied, removing his wet coat. "But a coffee would be welcome." "Of course, sit wherever you prefer. I'll bring the coffee to you," she said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Richard chose a table near the window, from where he could observe the rain punishing the street. He took his cell phone from his pocket and began sending messages, rescheduling the meeting. He was so concentrated that he didn't notice when she placed the coffee cup in front of him. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, already moving away. "No, please," Richard said, not understanding why he felt the need to prolong this interaction. "Are you the owner here?" "Yes, my name is Emily." "Richard," he responded automatically, extending his hand, and noticed that she hesitated for a moment before accepting the greeting. Her hands were small, with thin, calloused fingers, hands of someone who worked hard, so different from the manicured hands of the women he usually associated with. "You have a special place here," he commented, surprising himself with the sincerity in his own voice. "Thank you," she replied, and her gaze wandered over the shelves. "I built it gradually. Each book has a story." Richard took a sip of the coffee. It was exceptionally good. "Does this coffee have a story too?" A more genuine smile illuminated her face. "Yes, it's from a small farm in Vermont. They roast the beans especially for me." The conversation could have ended there. Under normal circumstances, Richard would have checked his phone again, finished his coffee, and left as soon as the rain diminished. But something kept him there, observing Emily as she moved between tables, serving other customers. There was a dignity in her simplicity that intrigued him. She didn't look at him with the calculated interest he was accustomed to. In fact, she seemed to have no idea who he was, which was refreshing and at the same time slightly irritating to his ego. When she passed by his table again, Richard pointed to a book of old photographs of the city that was on display in the window. "That book looks interesting." "It's a special edition," replied Emily, going to fetch it. "They're photographs of Chicago from the beginning of the last century." She placed the book on the table and opened it carefully. as if handling something precious. Richard surprised himself with his own interest as he leafed through the yellowed pages, observing images of a city he recognized, but that also seemed strangely distant. "Fascinating how everything has changed, but some things remain," commented Emily, pointing to a photograph of the Civic Opera House. "This building, for example, still stands majestic." "Have you been there?" asked Richard. A shadow crossed her face. "No, I haven't had the opportunity yet." "It's a magnificent place," he said, feeling a strange impulse to want to take her there. "The acoustics are perfect." Emily just smiled politely and moved away to attend to other customers. Richard remained in the bookstore for almost 2 hours, much longer than he had planned. He observed Emily working, noticing how her hands trembled slightly when she carried heavy trays, how she addressed each customer by name, how she constantly adjusted her glasses on her nose. When the rain finally stopped, Richard paid the bill, left a generous tip that Emily tried to refuse, and walked out onto the damp street. As he got into his car, he looked again at the small bookstore, feeling something that he couldn't clearly identify. It was as if that simple place had opened a crack in his perfectly controlled world. The following week, Richard couldn't stop, thinking about the bookstore and its owner. Amidst important meetings and business dinners, he found himself remembering the aroma of coffee and books, Emily's soft voice, her hard-working hands. It was almost without realizing that, on a sunny afternoon, he parked again in front of Coffee and Letters. Emily was behind the counter and seemed genuinely surprised to see him. "You came back," she said, adjusting her glasses. "I was passing by," lied Richard. In fact, he had driven 20 kilometers to get there, and I felt like having your coffee. This time, the bookstore was almost empty. Richard sat at the same table near the window and observed Emily preparing the coffee. There was a gracefulness in her movements, despite the evident fatigue. "How's business today?" he asked when she brought the coffee. "Quiet. Sunny days are. Always calmer around here." "Do you work alone?" "I have a helper who comes in the morning, but in the afternoons it's usually just me." Richard wanted to know more about her, but perceived her hesitation. Emily responded with politeness, but maintained a subtle distance as if she had erected an invisible wall between them. "That photo book," he said, changing the subject. "I ended up not buying it last time." "It's still available," replied Emily, going to fetch it from the window. When she returned with the book, Richard noticed a small bandage on her finger. "Did you hurt yourself?" She instinctively hid her hand. "It's nothing, just a small cut." For some reason, this gesture moved him. There was something fragile and at the same time strong about this woman. She seemed to carry an invisible weight that made her appear older than she probably was. The conversation flowed more easily this time. They talked about books, about the city, about the weather. Richard discovered that Emily had a degree in literature, that she had been running the bookstore for 5 years, that she lived in the apartment above the establishment. Small fragments of information that he collected as if they were rare gems. In the following weeks, Richard became a regular customer at Coffee and Letters. He began to schedule his meetings so he could pass by the bookstore in the late afternoon. He bought books he didn't read, just to have an excuse to stay. He observed the way Emily treated the other customers, always gentle, always distant. One day he arrived earlier and found her cleaning the shelves. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair loose falling over her shoulders. She looked younger, almost vulnerable. "Need some help?" offered Richard, leaving his expensive suit jacket on a chair. Emily looked at him in surprise. "You don't have to. You must have important commitments." "Nothing that can't wait," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. That afternoon they worked side by side, cleaning books, organizing shelves, moving furniture. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had done manual labor, but there was something strangely satisfying in seeing the immediate result of his efforts. And there was something more, the proximity of Emily, her discreet perfume, the sound of her laughter when he made a joke. At the end of the day, they sat exhausted with cups of coffee. The sun was setting, casting a golden light through the bookstore windows. Emily had a smudge of dust on her face, and without thinking, Richard reached out to clean it. His touch was light, almost reverent. She didn't move away, but her eyes, a deep brown that he hadn't noticed before, met his with an intensity that made him lose his breath. It was at that precise moment, with the dust of old books in the air and the smell of coffee between them, that Richard realized he was falling in love with Emily. And the revelation hit him like lightning, destabilizing everything he thought he knew about himself. Because Richard Morgan, the man who had everything money could buy, was falling in love with a woman who seemed unimpressed by any of that, and that was exactly the reason why he couldn't stay away from her. In the days that followed, Richard began to rethink his life, his priorities, his previous relationships. He realized how cynical he had become, how he measured people by what they could offer him or by the status they brought. Emily was different from anyone he had ever met, authentic, hard-working, unpretentious. And as the fall progressed, transforming the leaves on the trees and cooling the air, something was also transforming inside Richard. Something he couldn't name, but that he felt grow with each visit to the small bookstore, with each conversation with Emily, with each shy smile he managed to draw from her. What he didn't know was that Emily was harboring secrets, secrets that could change everything between them. The autumn months gave way to the Chicago winter, with its foggy mornings and afternoons of clear sky and cutting air. For Richard, this change of season coincided with an internal transformation that even he didn't fully understand. The pragmatic businessman, who had always maintained calculated and brief relationships, now found himself anxious to spend his afternoons in a small bookstore, just to be near a woman who seemed unimpressed by his status or fortune. Emily remained an enigma. As much as Richard tried to get to know her better, she always maintained a certain distance, as if she were afraid to get too close. Still, there were moments, small, precious moments, when he noticed her defenses lowering, like when they talked about literature or when she showed him some rare book she had acquired. On a particularly cold July afternoon, Richard arrived at the bookstore and found it exceptionally empty. Emily was sitting behind the counter, with a shawl over her shoulders, reading an old book with such concentration that she didn't notice his entrance. He observed her for a few moments before announcing himself. The way her fingers delicately turned the yellowed pages, how she slightly nibbled her lower lip when something intrigued her, how a strand of hair insisted on falling over her eyes. "Interesting reading?" he finally asked, making her look up with a start. "Richard, I didn't hear you come in." Emily quickly closed the book, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. "Business is slow today, because of the cold." "What were you reading?" "With such concentration." She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the book toward him. It was a volume bound in leather with a faded title, Letters of Fernando Pessoa. "I didn't know you liked Portuguese poetry," commented Richard, carefully leafing through the book. "There are many things you don't know about me," replied Emily, with a touch of melancholy in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. That phrase kept echoing in Richard's mind. Indeed, despite frequenting the bookstore for months, he knew little about Emily's personal life. She never mentioned family, friends, or previous relationships. It was as if her existence began and ended in that bookstore. "Why don't you close earlier today?" he suddenly suggested. "We could have dinner together." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities. Richard saw the conflict in her eyes, desire and fear fighting silently. "I don't know if it would be appropriate," she finally replied, adjusting her glasses in a gesture that he already recognized as a sign of nervousness. "It's just dinner, Emily. Two friends sharing a meal." She looked at her own hands, then at the empty bookstore as if searching for an excuse that wouldn't come. "All right," she agreed at last, with a shy smile that made Richard's heart race. "But I need to close the bookstore and change." "I can." "Wait," he said, feeling inexplicably victorious. An hour later, they were walking side by side through the streets of the historic downtown. Richard had suggested an elegant restaurant, but Emily counter-proposed a small Italian bistro a few blocks from the bookstore. She had changed from the simple dress she wore during work to black pants and a navy blue sweater that accentuated the paleness of her skin. Her hair, usually tied back, was loose, framing her face. The restaurant was cozy, low lights, dark wooden tables, discreet ambient music. The owner received Emily with familiarity, kissing her on both cheeks and leading them to a table in a quiet corner. "Do you come here often?" asked Richard, feeling a pang of jealousy that surprised him. "Giancarlo is an old friend," she explained. "He was one of the first customers of the bookstore when I opened." Something in her tone suggested there was more to this story, but Richard didn't press. Instead, he admired how she seemed more relaxed in this familiar environment, how she smiled more easily, how she gesticulated when speaking. Dinner proceeded with a naturalness that surprised them both. They talked about books, movies, music. Richard told stories of his travels around the world. Emily talked about the rare books she had acquired over the years. "How did you decide to open a bookstore?" he asked, as they savored a shared dessert, panna cotta with red fruit sauce. Emily twirled a lock of hair around her finger, a gesture that Richard had already noticed when she was thoughtful. "It was always my dream," she began. "Ever since I was a child, books were my refuge. I grew up in a home where reading was valued, despite other difficulties." "What kind of difficulties?" Richard tried to probe deeper, her face closed slightly. "Family ones, nothing interesting." He realized he had touched on a sensitive point and changed the subject. "And how did you find that space? It's an old building, must have a history." Her eyes lit up again. "Oh yes, the building is over 100 years old. It was a residence at the beginning of the last century, then became a hat shop, a law office, and finally was abandoned when I found it. It needed a lot of renovation, but it was worth every penny and drop of sweat." "Did you do it all alone?" A brief silence settled before she answered, "I had some help at the beginning." Again, Richard felt there was an unmapped territory there, something that Emily carefully guarded, but he respected her barriers, intuiting that pressing her would only make her retreat. After dinner, he insisted on accompanying her home, though he knew she lived on the floor above the bookstore. They walked slowly through the downtown streets, now almost deserted. The cold made Emily cross her arms over her chest, and Richard had to resist the impulse to wrap his arm around her. When they reached the bookstore door, they stood for a moment, neither wanting the night to end. "Thank you for dinner," she finally said with her eyes lowered. "It was pleasant." "The pleasure was mine," replied Richard, gathering courage. "Emily, I would like to see you more often, not just at the bookstore." She raised her eyes, surprised by his frankness. Richard could see the conflict in her gaze. There was desire, but also fear. "Richard, she began hesitantly. "You're a wonderful man, but our lives are very different. You belong to a world that I barely know." "Does that matter?" he challenged, taking a step toward her. "Maybe not to you now, but eventually it will." There was a sad wisdom in her voice that touched something deep in Richard. Before he could respond, she approached and, in a surprisingly bold gesture, lightly kissed him on the cheek. "Good night, Richard," she whispered, before disappearing through the side door that led to her apartment. Richard remained motionless, for a few minutes, feeling the ghost of that kiss on his skin. There was something about this woman that completely disconcerted him, a mixture of fragility and strength, of shyness and courage. And the more she tried to push him away, the more attracted he felt. In the following weeks, Richard intensified his visits to the bookstore. He brought small gifts, a box of Belgian chocolates, a silver bookmark, discreet flowers that matched the decor of the place. Emily accepted everything with polite gratitude, but maintained a cautious distance. Until one August afternoon, he entered the bookstore and found her pale and visibly exhausted, leaning on the counter as if her legs might give way at any moment. "Emily, are you okay?" he asked, alarmed. "Just a little tired," she replied, trying to smile. "Nothing serious." But as she spoke, her legs weakened, and she would have fallen if Richard hadn't quickly supported her. Without thinking twice, he picked her up in his arms and carried her to the sofa in the corner of the bookstore, ignoring her weak protests. "You need a doctor," he said, already taking out his cell phone. "No." The vehemence in her voice surprised him. "It's just fatigue, Richard. I've been working too much, not eating properly. I just need to rest a bit." He observed her with concern. There were deep circles under her eyes, and her skin was almost translucent. "When was the last time you ate something?" She hesitated. "I think last night." Richard felt a mixture of concern and irritation. "I'm going to get something for you to eat right now, and I won't take no for an answer." Without waiting for a reply, he left and returned 15 minutes later with a bag of food from a nearby restaurant. He closed the bookstore door, turning the sign to closed, and prepared a plate for Emily. While she ate slowly, Richard noticed how the bookstore, always impeccable, showed signs of neglect: dust on the shelves, books out of order, the counter disorganized. "Emily, what's going on? And don't tell me it's just fatigue." She put down her fork, suddenly looking very small and vulnerable on the large leather sofa. "The truth is that I'm having financial difficulties," she finally confessed, her voice almost inaudible. "Sales have dropped in recent months and the rent has increased. I let my assistant go to save money, but I've been working practically non-stop." Richard felt a wave of protection so intense that it frightened him. He wanted to wrap her in his arms, protect her from the world, solve all her problems. "Why didn't you tell me I could help?" A glimmer of pride lit up her tired eyes. "That's exactly why, Richard. I don't want to be just another person in your life who needs your money or influence." "That's ridiculous," he protested. "Friends help friends." "Is that what we are? Friends?" Her gaze pierced him, seeking something beyond his words. Richard hesitated. "You know I want to be more than that." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily lowered her gaze, playing with the food on her plate. "I'm afraid," she finally confessed so low that he barely heard. "Of me. Of us. Of what could happen. Of what you would discover about me." Richard sat beside her on the sofa, taking her cold hands in his. "Emily, look at me." She raised her eyes, bright with contained tears. "There's nothing you could tell me that would change what I feel for you. Nothing." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "I can, and I do," he replied firmly. "Whatever you're hiding, whatever your past is, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is who you are now here with me." A tear escaped, sliding down her face. Richard gently dried it with his thumb, feeling as if his heart would explode in his chest. "Give us a chance, Emily. That's all I ask." At that moment, something yielded in her eyes, an invisible barrier that slowly dissolved. Emily leaned forward, and in a gesture that surprised them both, touched his lips with hers. It was a hesitant kiss, almost timid, but loaded with repressed emotion. When they parted, Richard saw something new in her face. Not just vulnerability, but also hope. "One step at a time," whispered Emily, as if making a deal with herself as much as with him. "All the time in the world," agreed Richard, feeling that he had won something infinitely more valuable than any successful business in his life. That night, Richard didn't return to his penthouse in the Gold Coast. He stayed in the bookstore, helping Emily organize the space, catalog new books, clean dusty shelves. They worked side by side until late at night, talking about everything and nothing, sharing comfortable silences, exchanging glances and smiles that said more than words. And when they finally said goodbye, with the promise of a reunion the next morning, Richard knew that something fundamental had changed in his life. He, who had always measured his worth by what he possessed, now felt rich in a completely new way, by the simple fact of having won the fragile trust of a woman who sold books. What he didn't know was that Emily's secrets were deeper and more complex than he imagined, and that soon he would be tested to prove if his promises were really true, if his love was really as unconditional as he claimed it to be. Because Emily carried a past that not only haunted her, but that could completely change Richard's perception of her and of himself. Spring arrived in Chicago, bringing with it not only flowers and longer days, but also a transformation in the lives of Richard and Emily. What had begun as casual visits to the bookstore had evolved into a relationship that surprised them both in its intensity and depth. In the 3 months that followed that night in the bookstore, Richard had practically moved into the small apartment above coffee and letters. Not officially. His expensive suits and important documents still occupied the closet and office of his penthouse in the Gold Coast. But emotionally. Increasingly, he considered Emily's cozy space as his true home. Her apartment was like an extension of the bookstore, walls covered with shelves overflowing with books, carefully restored antique furniture, large windows that framed the city sky. It was a modest space compared to what Richard was used to, but it possessed a warmth, an authenticity that his own residence had never had. That Saturday morning, Richard woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the soft sound of Emily moving in the small kitchen. He remained lying for a few moments, observing the sunlight filtering through the light curtains, creating golden patterns on the ceiling. He felt a peace that he had never experienced before, a sense of belonging that all his fortune had never been able to buy. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Emily's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was standing in the bedroom doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, wearing only one of his white shirts that reached down to her knees. Her hair was disheveled, and she wasn't wearing her glasses, which gave her face a different softness. "Good morning," he replied, sitting up in bed and extending his arms to receive both her and the coffee. Emily sat beside him, handing him one of the cups. "Did you sleep well?" "Like never before," smiled Richard, softly kissing her lips. "I have a surprise for you today." Her eyes lit up with curiosity. "What kind of surprise?" "If I tell you, it won't be a surprise anymore," he teased. "But I need you to be ready by 3 in the afternoon, wearing something elegant but comfortable." Emily bit her lower lip, a gesture that Richard knew indicated her nervousness. Despite the months together, she still felt uncomfortable. With gifts or surprises, anything that suggested he was spending money on her. "Richard, you know you don't need to." He interrupted her with a kiss. "I know I don't need to. I want to. It's different." She sighed, yielding. "All right. But nothing extravagant, promise?" "I promise," he said, mentally crossing his fingers. The morning proceeded peacefully, with Richard helping Emily in the bookstore. On Saturdays, business was busier, with entire families seeking books or simply enjoying the welcoming atmosphere and quality coffee. Richard had discovered that he liked working there, recommending books he had read, operating the old coffee machine, chatting with regular customers who already recognized him as part of the place. It was an existence so different from his previous life, full of business meetings, formal dinners, and calculated interactions. There, in Emily's small world, he felt more authentic, more connected to something real. At 2 in the afternoon, he went up to prepare while Emily closed the bookstore exceptionally early. When she entered the apartment, Richard was already dressed in a discreet but obviously expensive navy blue suit. "You look handsome," she commented, kissing him quickly before going to get ready. Half an hour later, Emily emerged from the bedroom, wearing a simple but elegant light blue silk dress that Richard had bought for her the week before. The fabric flowed smoothly around her slender body, and she had pinned her hair in a loose bun that left some strands framing her face. She wore her usual glasses. She had refused to accept new ones despite Richard's insistence, and as her only jewelry, a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant in the shape of an open book, a gift from him on her birthday. "You look stunning," said Richard, feeling his heart race as if seeing her for the first time. Emily blushed slightly. "You're biased." "Shall we?" he invited, offering her his arm. "Our car is waiting." On the sidewalk in front of the bookstore, a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost was parked, with a uniformed driver holding the door open. Emily stopped, looking from the car to Richard with an expression of distrust. "You promised nothing extravagant," she reminded him. "It's not extravagant," defended Richard with a mischievous smile. "It's vintage, a classic from 1923, restored. I thought you, as a lover of old things with history, would appreciate it." Emily couldn't contain a reluctant smile. "You're impossible, you know that?" During the journey through the streets of Chicago, Richard observed Emily looking out the window, her delicate profile against the urban backdrop. There was something almost ethereal about her beauty, not the flashy type that used to attract him, but a kind of discreet grace that revealed itself slowly, like the pages of a rare book. "Where are we going?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "You'll see soon," he responded mysteriously. 20 minutes later, the car stopped in front of the majestic Chicago Civic Opera House. Emily looked at the building with wide eyes. "Richard," she whispered, moved. "You mentioned you had never been here," he explained, helping her out of the car. "I thought it was time to correct that." But it wasn't just a common visit. Richard had organized a private tour of the theater when it would be closed to the public. They were received by the artistic director personally, who led them through the opulent corridors, the noble hall, and finally to the grand main auditorium. Emily walked in reverent silence, lightly touching the architectural details, admiring the frescoes and sculptures. Her eyes shone with an emotion that Richard rarely saw in her, pure joy without reservations. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she said, when they were finally alone in the center of the empty stage, looking at the vacant audience. "It's not over yet," smiled Richard, giving a discreet signal. Suddenly the lights dimmed and a pianist emerged from the wings, sitting at the grand piano positioned in the center of the stage. Without announcement, he began to play Debussy, Claire, de Lune, filling the space with crystalline notes that hung in the air like raindrops. Richard extended his hand to Emily. "May I have this dance?" She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. There, on the stage of the most prestigious theater in the city, they danced slowly, just the two of them, under the music that seemed to envelope them like a blessing. "Thank you," whispered Emily against his chest. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." "You deserve this and much more," replied Richard, kissing the top of her head. When the music ended, the pianist discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone again. Richard guided Emily to the edge of the stage where 2 glasses of champagne awaited them. "A toast," he proposed, handing her one of the glasses. "To us." Emily accepted the glass, but there was a sudden shadow in her eyes. "Richard, before we toast, I need to tell you something." The serious tone in her voice made his heart tighten. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "You've been wonderful to me, more than I deserved or expected. But there are things about me that you don't know, things that I'm afraid to tell." Richard placed his glass on the floor and took her hands in his. "Emily, look at me. Whatever it is, we can face it together." She averted her gaze, fixing it on the empty theater. "It's not that simple." "Why don't we start with the basics, then?" he suggested gently. "You never talk about your family, your past, before the bookstore." Emily bit her lip, hesitant. Then, as if she had made a decision, she took a deep breath. "My real name isn't Emily Martin." The revelation hung between them like a bird with heavy wings. Richard felt a chill in his stomach, but kept his expression neutral, waiting for her to continue. "I was born Melissa Armstrong Foster. I grew up in Boston, in a traditional family." She paused, taking a sip of champagne as if seeking courage. "My father was an influential businessman, owner of sugar mills. My mother was a socialite. We had a privileged life, very similar to yours now." Richard absorbed the information, surprised but not completely shocked. He had always suspected that Emily, or Melissa, came from an educated environment. Her way of speaking, her knowledge of literature and art, indicated a privileged upbringing. "Why the change of identity?" he asked softly. Emily, Melissa, let out a trembling sigh. "At 18, I was sent to study in Europe. My parents wanted me to major in business to eventually take over the family business. But in Paris, I fell in love." Her hands were trembling slightly now, and Richard squeezed them, encouraging her to continue. "Her name was Claire. She was my roommate in the student residence." Richard felt a slight shock at the revelation, but remained silent, just caressing her hands with his thumbs. "She was my first true love," she continued, now speaking more quickly, as if afraid of losing courage. "We were together for almost 2 years, hidden from everyone. When my parents found out, there was a scandal. My father flew to Paris, practically took me out of the university by force and brought me back to the States. Tears began to form in her eyes, and Richard felt a deep pain for her. What happened next? I was kept practically in private captivity on the family farm. My father arranged a marriage with a business partner's son, a decent young man who would straighten me out, in his words. Her voice was bitter now. I tried to explain that it wasn't something I could change or control, that it was who I was, but they wouldn't listen. To them, I was sick, I needed treatment. Richard felt a wave of anger growing inside him, not directed at her, but at the people who had made her suffer. So you ran away? She nodded. The night before the wedding, I took what little money I had saved, some of my mother's jewelry, and disappeared. I changed my name, my appearance, cut all ties with my past. I spent some difficult years, working temporary jobs, always afraid of being found. And the bookstore, how did that happen? A small smile appeared on her face despite the tears. It was almost a miracle. I was working as a waitress in a cafe here in Chicago when I met an elderly lady, Mrs. Eleanor. She was a regular customer, always ordered the same thing, chamomile tea and a slice of orange cake. We started talking about books. She had been a literature teacher. Emily paused, lost in the memory. Over time we became friends. She had no children, no close family. When her health began to deteriorate, I started visiting her in the hospital, taking care of her things. She owned a small fortune and that building where the bookstore is now. It had been in her family for generations. And she left everything to you, guessed Richard. Yes, I was shocked. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. She said I should use the money to build the life I really wanted, not the one that was imposed on me. Emily smiled through the tears. Opening a bookstore had always been my dream. A place where stories could live, where people could meet, where I could finally put down roots without fear. Richard absorbed everything in silence. Finally, many things made sense. Emily's constant fear of being exposed, her hesitation to get close to him, her reluctance to be photographed or appear at social events. Are your parents still alive? Did they look for you? She nodded slowly. They're alive, yes. They looked for a while, but eventually, I think they gave up. Or maybe they decided it was better that I had disappeared than continue being a shame to the family. The bitterness in her voice was palpable, and Richard felt the impulse to protect her from all these painful memories. Emily, or would you prefer that I call you Melissa? Emily, she replied firmly. Melissa died a long time ago. Emily, he corrected himself. Thank you for trusting me enough to share this. It doesn't change at all what I feel for you. In fact, it only makes me admire you even more. She looked at him with suspicion. You're not disappointed or angry that I lied? You didn't lie, he corrected gently. You protected yourself. And as for the rest, who am I to judge your past or your choices? What matters is who you are now and what we've built together. A tear rolled down her face and Richard wiped it away with his thumb. There's more, whispered Emily, as if each word cost an immense effort. Something that could change everything between us. Richard felt a knot in his stomach, but kept his voice firm. I'm listening. Emily took a deep breath, looking directly into his eyes. Claire and I, when we were together, I got pregnant. Richard blinked, confused. What do you mean? It wasn't hers, obviously, explained Emily, with a slight blush on her cheeks. Before meeting her, I was with a guy a single time at a party. It was a mistake. I was confused about my feelings, trying to convince myself that I could be like the other girls. A few weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant. Richard felt as if the floor was moving beneath his feet. You have a child? Emily shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her face. A daughter, Sophie. She's 15 now. 15 years, repeated Richard, trying to process the information. Where is she? Why have I never met her? She lives in a boarding school. In Switzerland, replied Emily, her voice almost breaking. It was the only way I found to keep her safe, away from my parents, who would probably try to take custody of her if they knew she exists. I visit her 3 times a year, always discreetly. Now many things were beginning to make sense. Emily's sudden trips always alone, always for short periods, the calls she took in private, the expenses that didn't match the modest income of the bookstore. "That's why you refused my financial help," realized Richard. "You didn't want me to discover these expenses." She nodded, suddenly looking exhausted, as if the weight of so many secrets had completely drained her. "I would understand if this was too much for you," she said quietly. "If you want to end things, Richard interrupted her, pulling her into his arms. "End things, Emily? You're the most courageous and incredible woman I've ever met. What you did, surviving all this, building a new life from scratch, taking care of your daughter from a distance, requires a strength that few have." He pulled back a bit to look her in the eyes. "I want to meet her, Sophie, if you'll allow it, of course. I want to be part not only of your life, but of her life too." Emily looked at him in astonishment, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You really want that?" "More than anything," he replied with absolute sincerity. Something broke in her face then, not of sadness, but of relief, as if a weight she had carried for years was finally lifted from her shoulders. With a sob, she threw herself into his arms, openly crying now. Richard held her tightly, feeling her small body tremble against his. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he loved this woman, not despite her complicated past, but including it, embracing everything that made her the extraordinary person she was. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you entirely, with your past, your present, and if you'll allow me, your future too." Emily raised her face, her eyes bright with tears, but with a smile that illuminated her whole being. "I love you too, Richard, more than I thought. It was possible to love someone again." He picked up the forgotten champagne glasses and handed one to her. "So a toast," he proposed, raising his glass, "not just to us, but to Sophie too, to our family." "To our family," repeated Emily, her voice laden with emotion and hope. The glasses clinked softly in the empty theatre, the sound reverberating like a promise, and as the sun began to set, casting golden rays through the colored stained glass, Richard knew that he had found something much more valuable than all his material possessions, a true love, born not of convenience or appearance, but of complete acceptance, mutual respect, and the courage to be vulnerable. What he didn't know was that this courage would be tested even more, for Emily's secrets had not ended, and the biggest one was yet to come. The trip to Switzerland was planned to coincide with the summer school vacation. Richard and Emily disembarked in Geneva on a June morning, the fresh alpine air a welcome change from the American heat. From there, they rented a car to drive to Montreux, where Sophie's boarding school was located, a century-old institution on the shores of Lake Geneva, surrounded by imposing mountains. During the journey, Emily was visibly nervous, adjusting her seatbelt, repeatedly checking the small suitcase in the back seat that contained carefully chosen gifts for her daughter. "What if she doesn't like you?" she asked for the third time, biting her lower lip. "She can be difficult sometimes, teenagers, you know." Richard smiled, keeping his eyes on the winding road. "If she's half the amazing woman her mother is, I'll adore her even if she decides to hate me." Emily laughed nervously. "She looks physically like me, but her temperament, let's say she inherited her father's stubbornness." It was the first time she had mentioned Sophie's biological father, and Richard felt a pang of curiosity. "Did you keep in contact with him?" She shook her head. "He never knew about the pregnancy. It was one night and nothing more. He was Argentinian, an exchange student. He returned to Buenos Aires before I even discovered I was pregnant." "You never thought about looking for him? For Sophie?" Emily looked out the window, observing the lake glistening in the sun. "I thought about it, yes, many times, but I was afraid it might complicate the situation even more, and then it became too late." Richard nodded, understanding. Another secret, another layer of protection that Emily had built around herself and her daughter. The boarding school emerged before them, an impressive complex of stone and wooden buildings, with towers reminiscent of a castle. They parked in an area reserved for visitors, and Richard could feel the tension emanating from Emily as they walked to the main entrance. They were greeted by a middle-aged woman with an impeccable British accent who led them through silent corridors to an inner garden where, she explained, Sophie was waiting for them. And there she was, a tall, slender teenager with long, wavy brown hair like her mother's, sitting on a stone bench reading a book. She looked up when she heard footsteps approaching, and Richard could immediately see the resemblance to Emily. The same expressive eyes, the same face shape. "Mom!" exclaimed Sophie, standing up and running to hug Emily. Richard observed the reunion with a lump in his throat, the way they hugged each other tightly, as if they needed to confirm each other's existence after months apart. When they finally pulled away, both had tears in their eyes. "Sophie, I want you to meet someone very special," said Emily, extending her hand to Richard. "This is Richard." Sophie turned to him, her eyes, a darker brown than her mother's, assessing him with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "The boyfriend," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Sophie," said Richard, extending his hand. She examined him for a few more moments before accepting the greeting. "You're older than I expected." "Sophie," reprimanded Emily, blushing. Richard laughed. "I'm 36 years old. It's not that old." "And you're American," continued Sophie, ignoring her mother's embarrassment. Her English was perfect, without any accent that would betray her years in Switzerland. "Yes, I was born and raised in Chicago." "And you're rich?" Again, it wasn't a question. "Sophie, please," intervened Emily. "That's not relevant." "It's totally relevant, Mum," countered Sophie, crossing her arms. "The last time you were interested in someone was 3 years ago, that literature professor from the Sorbonne who left you for a student. And before that was that book restorer who ended up going back to her husband." Richard looked at Emily, surprised. She had never mentioned these previous relationships. "We can discuss my love life later," said Emily firmly. "How about we show Richard the campus, and then we can have lunch in town?" Sophie shrugged but picked up her backpack and began to guide them through the gardens. Gradually, her defensive posture dissolved as she showed them her world, the Idiot's library where she spent most of her free time, the science labs where she had won a prize the previous year, the small lake where she practiced rowing when the weather permitted. Richard observed her attentively, noticing how she talked with her hands just like Emily, how her face lit up when she discussed subjects that she was passionate about, how she alternated between moments of surprising maturity and flashes of adolescent vulnerability. During lunch, at a small restaurant by the lake, the conversation flowed more easily. Sophie bombarded Richard with questions about his life, his work, how he had met her mother. He answered everything honestly, realizing that any attempt to manipulate the truth would be immediately detected by those perceptive eyes. "So you've been frequenting my mother's bookstore for almost a year, but you've only been together for a few months?" asked Sophie, while savoring a chocolate. "Dessert." "Your mother is a difficult woman to win over," smiled Richard, looking affectionately at Emily. "And I'm grateful for that. It means that when she finally accepted me, it was for who I really am, not for what I have." Sophie studied him for a moment, as if looking for signs of falsity in his words. Apparently satisfied, she changed the subject. "Mom, have you told him about Aunt Laura?" The question fell like a bomb at the table. Richard felt Emily stiffen beside him, her face visibly paling. "Sophie, I don't think this is the appropriate moment to—" "When will the appropriate moment be then?" interrupted Sophie, her voice now laden with emotion. "Aunt Laura can't wait forever." "Who is Laura?" asked Richard, realizing he had touched on another buried secret. Emily sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "Laura is my younger sister." "You never mentioned having a sister," observed Richard, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "Because it's complicated," replied Emily, looking at her own hands. "Laura has health problems. She always has since childhood." "Schizophrenia," said Sophie directly. "My aunt has schizophrenia, and she's been institutionalized since my mother fled home." "Sophie," Emily's voice was a mixture of reprimand and pain. "It's the truth, Mom, and he deserves to know if he's going to be part of our lives." Sophie, turned to Richard. My Aunt Laura was the only one who supported my mother when they discovered about her and Claire. When my mother ran away, my grandparents blamed Laura. They said she had corrupted her older sister with her crazy ideas. They worsened her treatment as punishment. Richard felt a weight in his chest as he understood the extent of Emily's family drama. And is she still institutionalized? Emily nodded slowly. In a clinic in Boston, I send money monthly to ensure she has the best treatment possible. But I can't visit her. I can't reveal myself. If my parents found out, they could discover about me, completed Sophie, and they would try to take me away from her. A heavy silence fell over the table. Richard processed the new information, now understanding another reason for Emily's constant expenses, for her need to keep the bookstore running at any cost. That's why you were having financial problems when we got to know each other better, he deduced. It wasn't just the bookstore, it was all of this. Sophie, Laura, keeping your past hidden. Emily nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I should have told you before I know, but I was afraid. Richard extended his hand across the table, holding hers firmly. It's okay, I understand why you kept these secrets. But now you're not alone anymore, Emily. We can solve this together. How? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. I have resources, contacts, explained Richard. We can arrange for Laura to be transferred to a clinic in Chicago where you could visit her. We can bring Sophie to study closer to us. We can build a life where you don't need to hide anymore. Sophie observed the exchange with attentive eyes, her young face showing a mixture of hope and skepticism. He seems too good to be true, she commented to her mother, but with a small smile on her lips. Believe me, I thought the same when I met him, replied Emily, returning the smile. The next 3 days were filled with tours around Montreux and surroundings. Richard observed mother and daughter together, noticing how they sometimes communicated with just looks, how they shared the same tastes in food and literature, how they moved in synchronization. It was like witnessing a carefully rehearsed dance, the choreography of two people who, despite the physical distance, were deeply connected. On the night before returning to the United States, after Sophie had returned to the boarding school, Emily and Richard were walking along the lake shore. The air was fresh, and she wore his coat over her shoulders, looking small and fragile under the large fabric. Sophie liked you, she commented, breaking a long, comfortable silence. She doesn't show it openly, but I could tell. She's amazing, replied Richard sincerely. Intelligent, perceptive, brave like her mother. Emily smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. I miss her so much when we're apart. It's as if a part of me is always missing. It doesn't have to be that way, said Richard softly. We can bring her to Chicago, as I said. There are excellent international schools. She could live with us. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. With us? Richard took a deep breath. He hadn't planned to do this now, but the moment seemed perfect. The lake, glistening under the moonlight, the mountains like silent sentinels around them. Emily, I want to build a life with you, a life where you and Sophie can be together, where Laura can receive the care she deserves, where you don't need to hide or fear your past anymore. He took her hands in his. What I'm saying is, I want to marry you. Emily gasped, her eyes widening. Richard, I know it may seem hasty, he continued quickly, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, all. Of you, with all your past, your secrets, your struggles. I love the strength I see in you, the dignity, the integrity. I love how you built a life from scratch, how you protected your daughter and your sister, even at the cost of your own happiness. Tears began to form in her eyes, glistening in the moonlight. I don't have a ring with me now, he admitted, but I want you to know that this isn't a passing impulse. It's a decision I've been considering for weeks. I don't know what to say, replied Emily, her voice trembling. You don't need to answer now, assured Richard. But I want you to know that for me, you and Sophie are family, and family means nobody gets left behind. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to comprehend the depth of what he was offering. Then, in a sudden decision, she threw her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered against his chest. Yes, I want to marry you. Richard felt a wave of joy so intense that it almost made him dizzy. He hugged her tightly, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in the air, making her laugh through the tears. When he put her back on the ground, he kissed her deeply, tasting the salty flavor of her tears mixed with the sweetness of her lips. For a perfect moment, the whole world disappeared. There were only the two of them, their hearts beating in unison, their souls finally finding shelter in each other. Back in the United States, plans for the future began to take shape. Richard and Emily decided on an intimate celebration, just with close friends, to avoid unnecessary attention from the media. Meanwhile, Richard began discreetly exploring the possibilities of transferring Laura to Chicago and bringing Sophie to live with them after the end of the school year. Emily seemed to flourish with the new life perspective. The constant shadow of fear that had always inhabited her eyes began to dissipate. She smiled more easily, laughed more openly, allowed herself to dream of a future that before seemed impossible. The bookstore also prospered. Richard had hired an additional assistant, allowing Emily to focus more on the aspects she loved, selecting books, organizing small literary events, creating a welcoming space for readers. Coffee and Letters had become a cultural meeting point in the historic downtown, attracting students, intellectuals, and literature enthusiasts from all over the city. One August afternoon, while Emily was busy with a group of children for a storytelling session, Richard received a call that would change everything. It was a lawyer from Boston specialized in family law whom he had hired to discreetly investigate Laura's situation. "Mr. Morgan, we have a problem," said the grave voice on the other end of the line. "I've discovered that Ms. Foster's parents have intensified the search for her in recent months." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "What do you mean?" "Apparently they hired a private investigation agency. They're following several leads in Chicago. And there's something else you need to know." "What?" asked Richard, moving away so as not to be heard by Emily. "Ms. Laura Foster passed away 3 weeks ago. Complications from pneumonia, according to medical records. The parents are, let's say, determined to find Melissa, or Emily as she calls herself now, for the succession process. There are significant properties involved." Richard felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath his feet. The news of Laura's death would be devastating for Emily, and now her parents were actively looking for her, not for reconciliation, but for financial matters. "Thank you for the information," he said mechanically. "Continue monitoring the situation and keep me informed of any developments." Upon hanging up, Richard observed Emily through the glass door of the bookstore. She was sitting in a small chair, surrounded by children, reading a book with different voices for each character. Her face was animated, her eyes were shining. She seemed so happy, so at peace. How could he give her this terrible news? How could he tell her that the sister she had tried to protect from afar had passed away? That her parents were on her trail, threatening to destroy the life she had so carefully built? Richard made a decision at that moment. He would protect Emily at all costs. He would use his resources, his contacts, his power to ensure that nothing disturbed the happiness they had finally found together. But as he observed the woman he loved, an unsettling sensation settled in his chest. He knew deep down that not all the money or power in the world could stop the approaching storm. Some secrets cannot remain buried forever. Some truths demand to be heard, no matter how painful they are. And the biggest secret was yet to come, something that not even Emily knew, something that would fundamentally change everything between them. Because destiny has a sense of cruel irony, and the circles of life sometimes close in the most unexpected ways. Richard still didn't know, but he was about to discover that his past and Emily's were intertwined in ways neither of them could imagine, an invisible bond that connected them long before they met in that small bookstore on a rainy day. Richard knew he needed to tell Emily about Laura's passing and about her parents' intensified search. However, he decided to wait for the right moment, perhaps after finalizing the preparations for the wedding, which would take place in 2 weeks at a small vineyard on the outskirts of Chicago. Destiny, however, had other plans. One September morning, Richard was in his office at Morgan Construction when his secretary announced an unexpected visit. "A gentleman named Andrew Foster insists on seeing you. He says it's a personal and urgent matter." Richard felt his blood freeze in his veins. Andrew Foster, Emily's father, the man who had repudiated her and made her suffer. How had he discovered the connection between them? "Send him in," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Moments later, a tall and imposing man entered the office. Despite being probably in his 70s, Andrew Foster moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding. Perfectly trimmed grey hair, impeccably cut suit, erect posture, the perfect image of the traditional New England patriarch. "Mr. Morgan," he greeted with a slight nod, "I appreciate you receiving me without a prior appointment." Richard indicated a chair in front of his desk, carefully studying the man who had caused Emily so much suffering. "How can I help you, Mr. Foster?" Andrew sat down, carefully placing his leather briefcase on his lap. "I'll be direct, Mr. Morgan. I know that my daughter Melissa, or Emily, as she calls herself now, is in a relationship with you. I also know that you intend to marry soon." Richard maintained a neutral expression, though his heart was beating rapidly. "How did you discover this?" A humorless smile appeared on the older man's face. "I have resources and motives. Melissa is my firstborn daughter, heir to a significant part of the family business. From what I know, you disinherited her when she ran away," replied Richard, unable to completely hide the acidity in his voice. Andrew made a dismissive gesture with his hand. Words said in the heat of the moment. "Legally, she never ceased to be a Foster. What do you want after all these years? Why look for her now?" The older man adjusted himself in the chair, studying Richard with calculating eyes that strangely reminded him of Sophie. "My daughter Laura passed away recently," he finally said. "I'm sure you're aware of this." Richard nodded slowly. "I found out. I'm sorry for your loss." "Laura left a will, surprisingly organized for someone with her. Condition." Andrew opened the briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. "She left this letter to be delivered to Melissa after her departure. I respect my daughter's wish enough to fulfill her last desire, even disagreeing with her choices." He placed the envelope on the desk. Richard observed the name Melissa, written in a delicate handwriting on the front. "Why not deliver it personally? To Emily?" Andrew hesitated for the first time, a flash of true emotion crossing his severe face. "I thought it would be. Easier for her to receive this through someone she trusts." Richard felt an unexpected complexity in the situation. This man wasn't just the one-dimensional villain he had imagined based on Emily's accounts. He was an elderly father who had lost a daughter, and perhaps was finally realizing the cost of his actions. "There's one more thing," continued Andrew, removing another document from the briefcase. "Laura's will included a revelation that, well, it's better that you see for yourself." Richard took the offered document, a certified copy of part of Laura Foster's will. He began to read, and as the words penetrated his consciousness, he felt the world spin around him. "This can't be true," he murmured, rereading the crucial passage. "I'm afraid it is," replied Andrew. "I confirmed with DNA tests after discovering Laura was always unpredictable, even before her condition fully manifested." Richard abruptly stood up, walking to the window to try to organize his thoughts. The view of Chicago extended before him, but he barely registered the familiar landscape. "Emily doesn't know this," he finally said, not as a question but as a statement. "No, Laura kept this secret for years, even from Melissa. Why? Why come to me now with this information?" Andrew slowly closed the briefcase. "Because, despite what my daughter may think of me, I'm a man who values family above all. And because I believe that you both deserve to know the truth before proceeding with your plans." He stood up, extending his hand in a formal gesture. "I don't intend to interfere in Emily's life beyond this point. What you do with this information is your choice." Richard looked at the extended hand for a long moment before accepting it in a brief handshake. "Thank you for coming personally." After Andrew's departure, Richard remained motionless in his office, the documents on the desk seeming to weigh tons. How would he tell this to Emily? How would he put into words a revelation that would fundamentally change everything between them? He decided he couldn't postpone it. This was not news that could be softened or presented gradually. He cancelled all the day's meetings and drove to the bookstore with a heavy heart. The bell on the door announced his entry into Coffee and Letters. Emily was behind the counter, organizing a new shipment of books. Her face lit up when she saw him, but the expression soon transformed into concern. "What happened?" she asked immediately, recognizing the signs of disturbance that he tried to hide. "We need to talk," replied Richard, his voice deeper than normal. "In private." Emily nodded, asking her assistant to take over the counter. She led Richard to the apartment upstairs, the cozy space they had begun to share in recent months. "You're scaring me," she said when she closed the door. "Is it about the wedding? Have you changed your mind?" "No, it's not that," Richard quickly clarified. "It's more complicated. I need you to sit down, please." Emily obeyed, sitting on the edge of the sofa, her restless hands in her lap. Richard pulled a chair to sit in front of her, so close that their knees almost touched. "Today I received a visit at the office. Your father." Her face instantly paled. "My father? How did he—" "He has known about us for some time," explained Richard, gently. "And he came to see me for 2 reasons. First, to inform that Laura passed away a few weeks ago." Emily let out a small moan, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Laura? No." The words came out broken. "How?" "Pneumonia. Apparently it was quick. She didn't suffer." Richard hesitated before continuing. "She left a letter for you." He took the envelope from his suit pocket and handed it to Emily, who took it with trembling hands. For a few moments, she just looked at the name written on the front, caressing the handwriting as if she could feel her sister's presence through the paper. "I can't read it now," she finally said, placing the letter on the coffee table. "I don't have the strength." Richard nodded understandingly. "There's more, Emily, something that Laura revealed in her will. Something about Sophie." The mention of her daughter made Emily straighten up, suddenly alert. "What about Sophie? Do my parents know about her?" "Yes, they know, but that's not it." Richard took a deep breath, seeking courage. "Laura revealed the identity of Sophie's biological father." Emily frowned, confused. "How could she know?" "I never told anyone, not even Laura." "Because—" the word seemed stuck in Richard's throat. "Because Sophie's father is my brother, Edward." The silence that followed was absolute. Emily looked at him, as if she didn't comprehend the words she had just heard. What are you saying?" "My younger brother, Edward, studied in France as an exchange student for a semester, 16 years ago. In Paris, at the same university you attended." Richard spoke slowly, allowing each word to be absorbed. "According to Laura, they had a brief relationship, but Edward never knew about the pregnancy because he returned to the States before you discovered it." Emily abruptly stood up, walking around the room like a caged animal. "This is impossible. His name was Ernest, not Edward. He was Argentinian, not American. Laura wrote that he used his middle name and pretended to be Argentinian to impress girls. It was a rebellious phase. He wanted distance from the Morgan name and everything it represented." Emily stopped, leaning against the wall as if her legs could no longer support her. "No, this can't be true. Your father brought DNA test results that confirm it. Apparently, Laura collected a sample from Sophie during one of her visits to Switzerland and compared it with genetic material from my brother that she obtained. Well, I don't know how she obtained it." "Edward. Your brother." Emily seemed unable to organize her thoughts. "Where is he now? Does he know?" Richard shook his head. "Edward had a serious car accident 11 years ago. He was in a coma for 6 months and then he passed away. Nobody knows about this connection except us and your parents." Emily slowly slid down to the floor, her back against the wall. Silent tears streamed down her face. "Sophie is your niece," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "All this time—" Richard approached cautiously, kneeling in front of her. "Emily, I know this is an immense shock. It was for me too. But it doesn't change what I feel for you. It doesn't change anything between us." She raised her eyes, incredulous. "How could it not change? It's a sign from the universe, Richard, a warning that we shouldn't be together." "Or maybe it's exactly the opposite," he argued, taking her hands in his. "Maybe it's proof that we were destined to meet, that Sophie deserved to have her complete family, even if in a way that no one could have predicted." Emily withdrew her hands, hugging her own knees. "I need time. I need to process all of this." Richard nodded, respecting her space. "I understand. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." He slowly stood up, his heart heavy. "Do you want me to leave for now?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze lost in some distant point. Finally, she shook her head. "No, I just need a few hours alone. Please." "Of course," agreed Richard, leaning down to softly kiss the top of her head. "I'll be downstairs in the bookstore when you need me." The hours that followed were the longest in Richard's life. He tried to distract himself by helping in the bookstore, but his mind was constantly on the floor above, imagining what Emily might be thinking, feeling, deciding. When the last customer left and the assistant said goodbye, Richard closed the bookstore and sat in one of the leather sofas, waiting. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. Almost at midnight, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared, her eyes red from crying, but with a surprising calmness on her face. She carried Laura's letter in her hands, opened now, and sat beside him on the sofa. "I read the letter," she said simply, "several times." Richard waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "Laura knew about Edward long before I did. Apparently she met him during a visit to Paris, when I didn't even suspect I was pregnant yet. They became friends, in a way." Emily paused, carefully folding the letter. "She never told me because she feared I would try to contact him, which could lead our parents to me. And after he passed away, she thought it no longer made sense to reveal the truth," guessed Richard. Emily nodded. "Until now. In her letter, she says she had a dream, or a vision, as she calls it, where Edward asked her to complete the circle. That's why she included this revelation in the will." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the cosmic coincidence hanging between them. "What do we do now?" Richard finally asked. Emily took a deep breath, looking him directly in the eyes, for the first time since the revelation. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Richard, but I know that you brought light into my life when I thought I would live forever in the shadows. I know that you love Sophie as if she were your own daughter, and now I understand why. There's a blood connection that perhaps explains why we felt so naturally like a family from the beginning. Does this mean—" "It means I won't let ghosts from the past determine our future." She extended her hand, gently touching his face. "If you still want me after all this—" Richard didn't let her finish. He pulled her into his arms, embracing her with all the strength of his love. "I'll always want you, Emily, always, no matter what happens, no matter what obstacles arise. You and Sophie are my family now." She relaxed against his chest, the tears returning, but different now, not of pain but of relief, of renewed hope. "We need to tell Sophie," she said after some time. "Yes," agreed Richard. "She deserves to know the truth about her father, about her family." "She looks so much like him," murmured Emily. "The same eyes, the same smile. How didn't I notice before?" "Because we weren't looking for those connections," replied Richard gently. "Sometimes the most evident things are those we can't see until someone shows us." The following week, they flew again to Switzerland. This time, the trip had a different purpose: to reveal to Sophie the truth about her lineage, to show photos of Edward, to explain the incredible coincidence that had reunited her dispersed family. The teenager's reaction was positively surprising. After the initial shock and many questions, Sophie seemed to find comfort and even joy in discovering that Richard was, in fact, her biological uncle. "Does this mean I'll have a real family when I return to the States?" she asked, a rare vulnerability in her usually confident voice. "You've always had a real family with your mother," replied Richard, hugging her. "But yes, now you'll have even more people who love you. My parents, your grandparents, are eager to meet you." The reunion of the Morgan grandparents with the granddaughter they didn't even know existed was emotional. At first hesitant, they soon became enchanted with Sophie, recognizing in her undeniable traits of their lost son. As for Emily's parents, the process was more complex. The revelation about Sophie ended up opening the way for a cautious reconciliation. They weren't a perfect family. There were many old wounds, many resentments to overcome, but there was also a sincere desire to start anew, especially on the part of Emily's mother, who had lost one daughter and didn't want to lose the other. The wedding took place as planned, though with an expanded guest list to include family from both sides. In the small chapel of the vineyard, when Emily walked to the altar, it wasn't just Richard waiting for her, but also Sophie, dressed as a maid of honor, her eyes shining with happiness. "Are you ready for this?" whispered Richard when she reached his side. "For our new life?" "More than ever," replied Emily, smiling through the veil. The ceremony was simple and emotional. When they exchanged vows, they promised not only love and fidelity to each other, but also to build together a home where secrets would no longer need to exist, where the past would be honored but would not define the future. 3 years passed since that day. The Coffee and Letters bookstore continued to prosper, now under the joint management of Emily and Richard. Sophie, after completing her studies in Switzerland, had enrolled in the School of Architecture in Chicago and had moved in with them in the spacious apartment they bought in the historic downtown, a few blocks from the bookstore. The wounds of the past gradually transformed into scars, still visible but no longer painful. Laura was remembered with affection and gratitude for her crucial role in uniting the loose threads of the family history. On a sunny spring afternoon, Emily and Richard sat in the small garden of the penthouse, observing the sunset over the rooftops of Chicago. Sophie had gone out with friends, and the house was immersed in a comfortable silence. "You know," commented Emily, leaning against Richard's chest, "sometimes I think that all of this, the bookstore, you coming in just on that rainy day, the connection with Edward, is too fantastic to be coincidence." Richard caressed her hair, now lightly sprinkled with silver strands. "Maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it's the universe correcting its own errors, bringing back the balance." "Philosophizing, Mr. Morgan," she teased with a smile. "Learning from my wife, Mrs. Morgan," he replied, softly kissing her. As the sun disappeared on the horizon, illuminating the sky with golden and purple tones, both silently reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A journey of secrets, pain, loss, but also of discovery, acceptance, and above all, love. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the names they used or the masks they wore, not the mistakes they made or the fears they faced, but the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to begin anew. And as the first stars began to dot the night sky, Richard thought that perhaps true luxury in life wasn't what he had always believed. Not the private jets, the imported cars, or the high-end properties, but this, moments of absolute peace beside someone who knew his imperfections and loved him anyway. Because he had everything the world said was enough, but he had discovered that what really mattered was what no money could buy, a true love, built not on appearances or conveniences, but on shared truths and mutual trust. A love that began in a small bookstore on a rainy day, when a man who had everything found the only thing he was missing, someone who saw him not for what he possessed, but for who he was. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard and Emily's story has touched your hearts and shown that true love often emerges in the most unexpected places. For more stories like this, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives that explore the encounters, missed connections, and reconnections that destiny has in store for us. If this story awakened emotions in you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring new stories that celebrate the complexity and beauty of human relationships. Share in the comments if you've ever experienced or witnessed an extraordinary coincidence that changed the course of a life. Remember, sometimes what seems like mere chance might be the beginning of an extraordinary story. Until next time.